As it happens, the mission of the Institute is very close to that of the Society, and so it's a great pleasure for me to be your hostess. I would like to, I'm going to sit. It won't make much difference. My height, it will be about the same. So I would like, first of all, to introduce to you our speakers, conversationalists, debaters, if you will, although there will be much agreement, as is often the case with people who are very familiar with the subject and are intimately familiar, not merely superficially familiar, in which case the opinions tend to be more rigid, and the more one knows about a subject, the more one sees nuances. But I would like to first, as I said, introduce to you these distinguished speakers who have taken the time to be with us, and also give you a little background about how the actual topic of the debate has been conceptualized, and then we will have each of them talk to you for 10 minutes each, after which it will be followed by a 5-minute, I could call it rebuttal, but we'll call it follow-up. After which, if I have anything to ask, I will. But I plan to then turn it to all of you. So the balance of our time, I suspect, will end about 7:30. I hope very much that you will be moved to ask your questions, that they will indeed be questions rather than soliloquies, and that they be brief. So we have first, I will introduce Anna because she's our guest. Professor Darden is our own. He probably is well known to at least some of you. There's a student of his right here. But I will introduce Anna, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, focusing on Russia's policy toward the Middle East. So we could not have a better equipped person to instruct us on the topic. She's also a PhD candidate at George Mason University, and so she is very sympathetic to all of you who have things to do and write and struggle with. She is a fellow at the European Foundation for Democracy, and she was previously with the Atlantic Council and the Peterson Institute for International Economics. A former analyst for a U.S. military contractor in Afghanistan, she has also served as communications director at the American Islamic Congress. That's Zainab.
Yes, that's
it. Zainab al-Suraidi, she's actually a neighbor and terrific lady. She has a wonderful organization. Her analysis is published widely in Foreign Affairs, The Hill, The New Criterion, one of my favorites, and the Middle East Quarterly. Until recently, she conducted translation and analysis for the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies Office and its flagship publication, Operational Environment Watch, and wrote a foreign affairs column for Forbes. And everyone here must read her 2016 monograph, Russia in the Middle East. It's not very long, actually, and very informative, even though things have indeed happened since then. And she was born in Russia and emigrated here as a young person. Professor Darden is an expert on Eurasia, state building, nationalism, the politics of Russia, Ukraine, and given the importance of Islam in Eurasia, you have a very interesting additional perspective. So we are very truly thrilled that you're here. And on his website, personal website, he has a very interesting description of his research approach, and it's about 3 pages overview of his approach, and I very strongly recommend that you do read it. His award-winning first book, Economic Liberalism and Its Rivals, that Cambridge released in 2009, explored the formation of international economic institutions among the post-Soviet states. And he is also a co-editor of Cambridge University Press book series Problems of International Politics, and is actively engaged with Russia and Eurasia through the bilateral working group on US-Russia relations, PONAR's Eurasia, the Valdai discussion group, and other forums. He too has widely published in Foreign Affairs, Survival, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Le Monde, and so on. And I see you've even been on Sirius XM Radio and Voice of America, Echo Moscow. No trolling, I hope. And Ukrainian television. And it is my great pleasure to welcome both of you to address how are Russia's goals in the Middle East different from those of the United States? And can the US enhance its own interests through the use of sanctions? Widely understood, sanctions, whether against Russia or anybody else in the Middle East or elsewhere, is it helpful, is it not helpful? As I mentioned earlier, you will find, as we discussed before among ourselves, you will find a nuanced understanding of the situation, and therefore it is difficult to construct a pro-con approach to the question. But how can the US enhance its own interests doesn't actually permit of a yes or no answer. It implies that there are ways to enhance our interests with pros and cons to each possible tactic. The only thing that I suppose is fair to say is that Russia is not our friend. And in particular, let me say, and I know you're all sensitive to this, we are talking not about Russia, the society and the people, but its leadership. Never the two shall be conflated. We will start with Anna. And so please, you have 10 minutes, and I think the clock can start running now. Okay. Do you have the clock?
We're done.
Okay, good.
And the microphone's on. Great. Thank you very much. So I will start by talking about the first half of the question about Russia's goals in the Middle East and touch on how they're different from the United States. And then in the second half, I will talk about the issue of sanctions. So historically, for the Kremlin, the Middle East was an arena of competition with the West. In this context, Imperial Russia began asserting its interests in the region, and its successor, the Soviet Union, was a major player in the Middle East that worked to stymie Americans' efforts and the efforts of those of its allies. When Vladimir Putin came to power officially in May 2000, if not before, he began the return of Russia back to the Middle East. This was a quiet, this wasn't something many people were paying attention to at the time, but it was you can see it in the statements that came out from the Russian government. There was a clear intent to bring Russia back to the region, and it was rooted in the vision of Yevgeny Primakov, the former Russian prime minister who asserted a more anti-Western vision for Russia. So in this vein, for Putin to win in the Middle East, the West had to lose, and really the United States. I think oftentimes when Russians talk about the West, it's really a euphemism for the United States. So zero-sum anti-Westernism. Syria is a strategically vital country in the region, just if you take a look at the map, with whom the Kremlin historically had a very special relationship. And similarly, it was key to Putin's calculus as well. That said, he had his eyes on the entire region, not just Syria alone. In the Middle East, Putin worked to regain political, diplomatic, and economic influence using increased cooperation in diplomatic exchanges, arms and energy sales, and provision of high technology goods such as nuclear reactors. His approach was different from that of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had an ideology, a very specific communist ideology. Putin's approach was to talk to everybody in the region. He was unconstrained by the ideology. It's also how he differed from the United States, because we do have allies in the region. Whereas for Putin, it was more about making connections with everybody, every major government, and every major opposition movement. So by 2010, Putin had already gained much influence in the region precisely through these steps that he had taken. In more recent years, we've seen Russia playing an increasingly influential role both in the Middle East and North Africa. The Russian intervention in Syria, however, shocked and surprised many. But Putin supported Assad unequivocally and in multiple ways since protests broke out against Assad in Syria in March 2011. So here's where we get to another point of the differences between Russian and American goals. Putin was supporting a genocidal dictator, making sure that this person stayed in power, and this is somebody that we said must go. Putin ultimately intervened, in my view, because he perceived weakness from the West, and he capitalized on Western retreat from the region. Putin's main objective, I would argue, is to stay in power, and for the Kremlin to stay in power is often about the United States, or more broadly about the West, as both a foil on whom they can blame their own domestic failings, that is the Russian government, and as a partner whose elites they can corrupt through engagement. And is in this context, this is the context, I think, for understanding his Syria intervention. And so for Putin, Syria provided an amazing opportunity to capture so many of these interests as they pertain to his goals of regime survival, projecting great power status and forcing the West to treat Moscow as an equal, weakening the West by helping Assad flood Europe with refugees, distracting from the Ukraine crisis and working to force the West into a dialogue on its own terms. A domestic distraction for the Russian public, and this is also, I think, an important line that doesn't get enough discussion, the blurring between domestic and foreign policy, which has very deep roots in Russian history. Deterring the West, Putin's fear of regime change, the so-called color revolutions. Putin genuinely believes that the West supports all anti-authoritarian protests, including against Putin himself, and he said this on a number of occasions. He can't even conceive that people do this on their own. So this was extremely important to him. Syria provided a training ground for the Russian military, and Syria as a testing and advertising arena for Russian weaponry to boost Russian arms sales. Reducing U.S. ability to maneuver in the region, that's the way, if you looked at how the Russian government positioned its military, it was not meant to fight ISIS, as the Russian government claimed. It was about deterring the West, creating the so-called anti-aerial access denial bubble to limit American ability to maneuver. This is also about creating and extending buffer zones, and the search for buffer zones is consistent with the history of the Russian state. So these interests, as I've outlined, they don't include goals of genuine peace, lasting peace, as we understand it, and that stands in stark contrast from U.S. goals in the region. It's better, I would argue, for Moscow that the Middle East stays simmering, not quite boiling over, but simmering with low-grade conflict, because that creates a need for Moscow to be there to sell arms to everybody in the region and to project great power status as a neutral power broker, and I say that in quotes. Nor is Moscow, I would argue, genuinely capable of real peace mediation. And so here we turn to the issue of sanctions. I wanted to say a few things on this point. My answer to that is, again, it's not a yes or no. It's an unsatisfying, it depends. Certainly, look, even if you look at earlier sanctions against Assad, sanctions experts themselves, who understood very well how sanctions worked, warned that sanctions against Assad alone will not be enough. If you look at the effect of sanctions against Russia, certainly they've sent a clear message which was extraordinarily important, and the Russian government knows it and doesn't like it. And the fact that Putin brought up Bill Browder during the Helsinki summit in July is a clear testament to how much Putin does not like the wide variety of sanctions that have been enacted against his regime. But the sanctions alone, without a clear policy, they haven't been enough to fundamentally change the Russian government's behavior. And so this is where my answer comes of, it depends. Where I stand on sanctions depends on how you define success. They were and remain important. But in the absence of a clear policy, they're not enough to necessarily fundamentally change behavior, but they can be helpful on certain tactical issues. And so really, I'd like to end there. I think my time is ending. What I would argue for is for sanctions as a tool, one of several that is incorporated in a much broader policy framework, one that is part of a clearly articulated vision that unfortunately has been absent for quite some time, both when it comes to the Middle East and Russia. And
thank you, Anna.
Thanks. So we may actually have something to disagree about. This is great. I think about Russia a little bit differently, and Russia's role in the Middle East is just one part of thinking about Russia and the way the United States needs to respond. The U.S. National Security Strategy that came out in December 2017 was different from the previous ones, which had focused on things like spreading liberty in the world, counterterrorism. It really focuses on great power competition, and in particular competition between the United States, Russia, and China. And I think about the Middle East not from the perspective of a Middle East expert, but as one theater in that broader competition between the United States, Russia, and China. And I think we should probably not get too distracted by Russian actions in any one theater. That we need to keep our eyes on the prize. The ultimate goal of limiting the Russian threat more broadly sometimes means making concessions in some regions or allowing Russia to get deeply engaged in regions in a way that hurts their interests and doesn't necessarily help ours. And I think that's largely true of Russia's behavior in the Middle East. And I'll try to make 3 points tonight. One is that the current Russian presence in the Middle East is quite manageable. And in fact, it's quite complementary in many ways with U.S. interests, not at odds with our interests. They may think that they're engaging in a zero-sum game, and I absolutely agree with them on that. But ultimately, what they're doing is not terribly harmful to us. Second, Russia has effectively won the civil war in Syria for the Assad regime. But it's going to be a lot harder to win the peace. And that the military defeat of all of your main adversaries on the battlefield is not the political goal of bringing stability to a territory with a Russian allied leadership. And Assad is going to have a very hard time hanging on to this particular plot of territory, and the Russians are likely to spend more resources in winning the peace than they were in winning the war. And there's a strategy in great power competition called bleeding the enemy. And there's an argument to be made that this is an area where we can fruitfully bleed the enemy. This is not to say I don't care about the population of Syria. I definitely do. I share many humanitarian concerns with the rest of you. But I think that we can get Russia perhaps to spend its resources to address those concerns. The concerns of reconstruction, the concerns of overcoming the sectarian divides, all the things that will be necessary to rebuilding Syria, and that if Russia is paying those costs, that serves our interests, just like our paying those costs in Iraq served Iran's. Okay. Third, our primary concern in the Middle East should be shoring up our allies and maintaining our pressure on Russia internationally for the areas where we do want to constrain them. So in other words, maintaining our broader sanctions regime. And that means not allowing sanctioned Russian entities to sell weapons to our allies. And so I will make the case that sanctions are appropriate should countries that we are ostensibly allied with be undermining our own collective sanctions regime against the Russian Federation, because that's interfering with our goals in other locations, particularly in Europe, particularly in Ukraine. Okay, point one. The Russian current presence is manageable in the Middle East. Now, as I said, we don't have shared interests with Russia in the Middle East. In other words, we don't both want Assad to stay in power. He is not both of our allies, right? But we do have complementary interests. And that Russia's presence has been better than Russia's absence would have been over the last 3 years. Russia cooperated with us on Iran sanctions. It's important to remember that, right? So this was an important Obama administration achievement, which has been undone, but nonetheless it shows that we can actually work with the Russians on some key issues. But most importantly on Syria, what we were facing in 2015 when the Russians intervened was not the victory of the Free Syrian Army, right? That was a pipe dream. What we were facing was the victory of ISIS and al-Nusra, right? So Al-Qaeda. These were not good allies for us. In other words, the enemy of your enemy isn't always your friend. And these people were arguably less friendly towards us than the Assad government. And it was better, and certainly in our interests, I think, to have Syrian government control over most of Syrian territory than it was to have these groups in control of Syrian territory. Particularly since had they been victorious, it would have led to the mass killing and exodus of the Alawite populations, right? So this is a sectarian society, it was a sectarian war. Anytime one side loses, it's going to lead to a large number of refugees. So in this case, Russia's presence, even Assad's presence, right, despite the fact that he's a genocidal dictator, right, it might be better than the alternatives, because we would not likely have ended up with someone who is not a genocidal dictator. And this way we can get a more stable outcome. Russia's role in Syria is also preferable to Iran's, and in many ways they are substitutes for one another. They sometimes seem like an alliance, like they're complements, but really Russia's presence often means Iran's absence. And Russia cooperates quite effectively, or at least coordinates quite effectively with some of our allies in the region, like Israel. Israel informs Russia when it's going to strike Iranian forces. It would not be informing Iran if it were striking Iranian forces. And because Russia plays this kind of limited power in the region, it's sort of an offshore balancer in traditional language, right? It's less dangerous than the dominant threatening regional power, which is Iran. So it's a complicated relationship that we have with the Russians in Syria, but it's workable. And it's probably better than if they weren't a big player. Okay. Russia's goals are quite limited also, right? They wanted to prevent the fall of Assad, quite reasonable. Right, and preserve the Syrian regime, which was a longtime ally of theirs. They demonstrate also, as Anna said, that they're a great power. They're not just a regional power, as Obama called them. And it forces the United States to deal with them. They want to be in dialogue with the United States. They want to be one of the decision makers on the world stage. And having an expeditionary force with the capacity to alter events on the ground, distant from your shores, is one way to do that and demonstrate that. And because they're staying there, and they are staying there, this is maybe a drawback, which is that they're training up their forces. In other words, they're getting a lot of battle experience, they're rotating their commanders through this region, but at the same time, right, they're keeping it a limited scale, right, to a limited scale. We're talking about 5,000 troops, 30 to 40 aircraft. We're not talking about a major expansion. They've done some development of the seaport at Tartus. But even then, we're not talking about a major presence. Okay, so it's livable, it's manageable, and it's not too harmful to us. Point two, Russia won the war, but I think they're losing the peace, or likely to lose the peace. Okay. Why? Well, the presence in Syria is costly to them. They gain something from it. They gain the training, but they have to produce more munitions. They are losing aircraft sometimes, right? They're going to be putting a lot of money into reconstruction if there's going to be any kind of reconstruction at all. And quite frankly, if Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah have to focus on reconstructing Syria, it means they are not focusing on doing things which are far more harmful to us. Okay? And so these resources, which are limited, let's sink them here. Right? Let's not sink them into eastern Ukraine. Let's not sink them into our conflict with North Korea and Taiwan. Let's let them focus their resources in this spot. And I think that they're going to have to focus them if they're going to get an outcome that is desirable to them. Because really what we're looking at here is protracted instability. Right? Victory is no victory in the Middle East. The conflict is not going away. Moreover, Israel has stayed back to a great extent. But Israel is not going to allow Iranian troops on its Syrian border to have a permanent presence. It's not going to allow the creation of what's called the Shiite Crescent, right? Linking Tehran to Beirut. That's not happening. So we're in a pause in this war, but Israel's about to change that, right? And is in the process of changing that. And it's not really clear how Russia is going to come down in that situation. They're going to have a very difficult balancing act between Turkey, Iran, and Israel. And we have no idea whether they're going to be able to manage that as well as they've managed the war. Because everybody agreed that it was a good thing to defeat ISIS. Okay, point 3. Let me just jump to that. What should the U.S. do? Again, our primary concern in the Middle East is making this broader global picture look better for us. And in that broader global picture, we need to shore up our alliances. Our alliances are very important to us. Right? It's very important that we have foreign bases. Right? And ultimately, we have a NATO member in this region. We have Turkey. Right? And we have Israel, which is not a member of NATO, but is about as close alliance as one can have. Right? And so, what do we do about this? Right? We need to implement our broader strategy with respect to Russia. Right? In other words, sanctioning them, limiting their power, right? By putting stress on their economy. We would expect that our allies would go along with this. Turkey, however, has shown great interest in purchasing an anti-aircraft missile defense system from Russia, the S-400 system, a very sophisticated system, which would cause lots of problems for us, and which fills the coffer of a sanctioned entity, export. Right? And so that's not the behavior of an ally. That's Turkey putting its narrow regional national interests ahead of the broader perspective of being part of a US-led alliance. And we should punish Turkey for that, if that's something that they want to do. Or they should be aware that this will not go unsanctioned. And so I don't think sanctions are a great thing with respect to your own allies, but I also think allies need to behave like allies. And we should very much put that on the table in our relations with the Turks. Egypt, similarly, seeking to buy Russian weapons, in part because the Obama administration was not terribly pleased with the coup and the overthrow of the Morsi government. But we give Egypt $1.5 billion in military aid a year, and we have for several decades, right? And we don't give them that money for the purpose of buying weapons from sanctioned entities by the United States. So again, I don't think we need to think about sanctioning the Egyptian government, but we can certainly put on the table that the Camp David related aid that we provided to them is in fact conditional, and that Israel is now in a position to defend itself. We don't need to worry that the breakdown of relations between Israel and Egypt is going to be a problem, particularly since Israel has a very good relationship with this particular Egyptian government. And so we should put pressure, right? In other words, we need to keep Russian influence limited in this region, right? So if they try to extend both through their arms sales or through picking off members of our alliance, right? That's something to be constrained. But the status quo is totally acceptable to U.S. interests. Leave it at that.
Well, congratulations to both of you for keeping under your time limit. Would you like to respond to that, Anna?
Sure. No, this is great. I actually agreed with most of your points.
However,
on bleeding the enemy, I completely agree that that's what we should be doing. We should be bleeding the enemy. And in fact, one of the first articles I wrote with Russian-Syrian intervention when it just started is that's exactly what we should be doing. So I completely agree with that. The problem is, up until now, we haven't really done enough to bleed the enemy. So, when President Obama talked about Russia finding itself into a quagmire, we haven't really created a quagmire for them. We just sort of assumed that it would happen on its own, but it didn't. It will be interesting to see what will happen in the months ahead. There has been a recent change in U.S. policy with staying in Syria beyond simply defeating ISIS, but also now we're talking about Iran's malignant activity, and this is a change in the discussion. And here, it may very well be that Russia could, down the road, find itself into a quagmire. If you look at how the Russian intervention was designed, how the Russian government did it, they were pretty conscious of a possibility of a quagmire. It was a fairly limited operation, and that's why this was not another Afghanistan. This was, as I said, about 5,000 that we know of publicly available troops, advisors, whatever you want to call them officially, mercenaries. With Afghanistan, what happened is that thousands of body bags started coming home, and this is what the quagmire was. Thousands of body bags instead were coming home to Iran, not to Russia. And frankly, because the mercenary technique, these were volunteers who were paid to go to Syria. This was a fundamentally different dynamic. So the only thing I'd say is that we haven't yet created a quagmire for them. And Russia now has a permanent military presence. It's a limited footprint, but it is permanent. And this segues into Iran. Now the Russian relationship with Iran. Now here's what's interesting. These are historic rivals. Russia and Iran are historic rivals who fought two wars in the 19th century, and Iran ceded territory to the Russian Empire both times. But their relations began to warm really by the late 80s with Khomeini's death. Where I would disagree with a little bit is the extent to which Russia truly limits Iran. The Russian government plays a very skillful balancing act, maintaining relations between Israel and Iran. And they love to present themselves as this neutral mediator, right? Somebody that could broker within a conflict if it were to erupt. And certainly, if you talk to the Israelis, many Israeli officials feel that Russia is a lesser evil in Syria. So I understand your point. The problem is Russia also empowers Iran, and Russia also supports Hezbollah. Russia supports by and large terrorist organizations. Russia invites Hamas to come to Moscow. And while they maintain relations with both Israel and Iran, whenever Israel acts out of line, the Russian government never fails to publicly make that point. You should have made us aware of what you were doing. And we saw what happened recently with the shooting of the Ilyushin-20 airplane, and certainly the S-300 that have been delivered to Syria. This was a message. This was a message to the West, and it was a message to Israel, and at least for the short term, Israel had ceded that message. Now, we can have a conversation about how powerful the S-300s were. There's a whole separate discussion in terms of what variant it was and whether or not the Israeli government has the capabilities to shoot it down and so forth, whether it's more symbolic than real. But aside from that, the message is pretty clear. There's also the issue of whether Russia whether or not Russia really has leverage over Iran. And that's also, you constantly hear Russian officials, and Putin himself just said it at the recent Valdai conversation, that they don't have leverage over Iran. So, to me, the question of the Russia-Iran alliance is really quite critical in Syria, because the entire Syria strategy is predicated on Iran, but also, despite the talk of neutrality, the Russian policy clear has a pro-Shia tilt, and this is an anti-American Shia bloc with which the Russian government, despite its many differences with Iran, is in a better position to confront American interests than on its own. Again, look, down the road, if there were a conflict that could break out between Israel and Iran, or Israel and Hezbollah, if the Russian government were forced to do the one thing they don't want to do, which is choose sides formally, they could very well find themselves in this quagmire, which is why this recent policy shift in U.S. politics is so interesting. But for me, it remains to be seen. On Assad, here's the thing about Assad and terrorism. Early on, when protests broke out against Assad, it was Assad who opened the infamous Sidnaya prison that let out the radicals, and Assad injected radicals into the protest movement. So he's not really the stabilizing force he claims to be, and for all of his talk about taking over every inch of Syria, he really doesn't have. It's one thing to take territory, it's quite another to control and hold territory. So he really depends on Russia and Iran to hold territory. And I agree, the issue of reconstruction is also incredibly important, that Russia does not have the resources for reconstruction in Syria. They talk about it quite actively. They really hope that Europe does it for them. The issue for me is, again, what kind of a stabilizing force can Russia really be? That's really, what it comes down to for me is, do they genuinely want peace the way we understand it, or is this going to be another frozen conflict that we've seen in the post-Soviet space? Certainly agree on Turkey. Allies need to behave like allies. I completely agree with you. And Turkey is not behaving like an ally, and we should be making that clear. Israel is, but Turkey is not. In terms of their goals in the Middle East too, on the one hand, you can argue, yeah, they've been fairly limited and careful, because I think the Russian government understands that they're not a superpower despite all their talk. And in fact, the tactics, again, that they deploy mercenaries, right? These are more of an insurgent tactics than tactics of a great power. But in terms of the connections that they're making with all of Middle Eastern countries, they may not seem like much, even with North Africa, with Morocco, but it's a case of growing influence. Egypt certainly is another country that is falling very much into the Russian camp. Russia is building a nuclear power plant for Egypt. Egypt used to be our partner on nuclear energy security. So I guess I'm a little bit more worried about their influence, because while Russia is not our equal, they don't have to be an equal to pose a challenge for our interests. And these may not seem like big things, but nobody expected Assad to intervene in Syria. And it's Russia that saved Assad from an imminent fall, and nobody expected that.
Yes, thank you. Would you like to?
Sure, I'll be brief. Yeah.
Sorry,
Because I think we'll open it up.
No, don't
Yeah.
apologize. We need to be instructed.
Yeah.
All of us.
Yeah. I'll just make a couple of points to clarify. When I say that we should pursue a strategy of bleeding the enemy, I don't mean literally bleeding the enemy in the sense of sending home body bags, because ultimately, yes, that was perhaps involved in the end of the Soviet Union, literally bleeding the enemy by supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. But the long-term consequences of that are terrible. The short-term humanitarian consequences and the long-term strategic consequences are not good, right? So I don't think that we should have done what the Saudis or the Qataris did, which was, channel money and weapons to fighting units on the ground to make the war bloodier, more costly, and more devastating. I don't think that was in our interest. What I mean by bleed is the reconstruction costs. In other words, the costs of making this a successful political endpoint to a military intervention are going to be really high. And I think we should let them pay those costs. I actually think that our goals and Russian goals in Syria were quite complementary, right? That they were the anvil and we were the hammer when it came to ISIS. If they had not been able to push ISIS back to the Euphrates, we would not have been able to come from the other side. They would have spilled over and we would have had a lot more to deal with. We would have been fighting our way to Damascus rather than Damascus fighting its way to the Euphrates. Right? So I do think that in terms of fighting and body bags, we did not want Russia to have a high casualty count here. We wanted ISIS to have a high casualty count. And ultimately that's what's happened. And now we want them to spend a lot of money rebuilding the country. And that's an important distinction. But I think that's a more humane policy of restraint in some ways. Let them do the pain. With respect to Iran, I don't think Russia supports Hezbollah. And I don't think that, Russia does talk to Hamas, but so do the Israelis, right? Quite extensively talk to Hamas. And so Russia is playing a complicated role in the region, but they're certainly not throwing their weight fully behind Iran. hence the agreement to sanction Iran when the United States put forth the sanctions policy. And that, that ended quite recently. Right? This is something that, has been a feature of the Putin regime. Right? And so I don't think that they are, I think the right way to think about them is as substitutes for Iran. They are not, they don't have leverage on Iran. Nobody does, right? These are, just like we don't really have leverage on Israel either. Like these regional players, and we have limited leverage on Turkey. We can put pressure on them, but these are countries in the region that are powerful enough and have an articulated sense of their own interest. But I think we're happy having that substitution and having Russia playing that role. The thing that might be, I think you raise a good point, which is that if Russia hadn't intervened, would they have been successful? In other words, would Iran have, would they have brought Assad back? But I think the cost to us of Assad's defeat are greater than, I'm not sure that would have been a good outcome for us.
Did you want? No, maybe at this point I will ask a quick question. And I will ask this of both of you because I would like to challenge, if that's the word, the idea that Russia would in fact help with reconstruction in Syria. I honestly cannot see that because there's an additional advantage to the Syrian quagmire, and that is all the evil that is being caused to Europe. Wonderful side benefit. So does either of you really conceive? I understood that the bleeding you're talking about relates to
Is a resource bleeding.
Resource bleeding.
Yeah.
But considering the enormous economic problems that Russia has at home, what are the chances of that? And so if you could both address this, but I also have a very specific question to you, Anna, which is related. It's part of the same. You mentioned that we haven't yet, or we haven't, erected a quagmire for Russia in Syria. How are we supposed to do that? A quagmire. I mean, how can we force the bleeding, if that's the way? I understand. I don't suspect that you mean by quagmire literal bleeding either. So that's the broad question. If you could address that, I would be great.
Sure. Yeah, and I also did not mean literal bleeding.
Of course.
Exactly. Look, I think what I was just, because our own presence in Syria was so limited, we were focused on fighting ISIS. We haven't addressed Iranian expansion to the extent that we could, perhaps, and the fact that Assad does not have the full grip on the country that he says he does. Perhaps one way, and this is by no means a definitive thing, but what I was alluding to with forcing Russia to choose sides. Because they are more wedded to Iran than they are to, they certainly want to have both, but they are more wedded to Iran. If there was a way...
That to Assad?
No, sorry, to Israel, I'm sorry, to Israel. So they are more wedded to Iran than they are to Israel.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, well, I just want to state the obvious, If there was a way, look, I don't think Russia wants to be stuck in the middle of a war between Israel and Iran. I think that they're actually quite frightened of a possibility like that. So, and because we're now making a more exerted effort to fight Iran, perhaps this is kind of where I see the roots of a possible quagmire if Russia has to choose sides. Because again, historically, I think Putin studied the fall of the Soviet Union very well. He extracted a number of lessons for himself, and this policy of being friends with everybody is a big shift from how the Soviet Union approached things in the region. And I would argue he has been more successful because he was not wedded to an ideology. I'm sorry, your other question was
Reconstruction.
I mean, it's clear that the Russians don't want to pay for reconstruction. And they're sending that message loud and clear. They don't have the resources. They don't want to do it. I'm not sure. The question is, how would they be put in a position to be forced to spend those resources? And maybe there is a way to do that. I'm not sure. And I'd love to hear ideas. Maybe there is a way to do it. I'm just not sure what that would look like. But they make it clear that no, they don't want to pay for the cost. Now the issue is the Europeans don't want to pay for Syria either, and we're not going to pay. Now China is making, there's talk about China, but there's also issues with that as well. I'm not sure if China will be paying for reconstruction of Syria. So nobody wants to pay for reconstruction in Syria, and I'm not really quite sure where that leaves us, other than with an unresolved conflict. I guess, the other point that I just want to raise is in terms of Russia in Syria and what kind of role it plays, whether or not our goals are complementary or not. I guess this is where I disagree. In terms of Assad in power, I don't see how keeping Assad in power is helpful to our interests when refugees are not going to want to return to Syria for as long as Assad is in power. We're never going to fully defeat ISIS. We're certainly weakened it, but we are, for a while now, analysts have been talking about an ISIS 2.0. And with having a man like Assad in power, I worry that the Middle East is going to continue to prove, and it's a conflict that's going to keep spreading to Europe, and so it's going to hurt our interest with him in power.
So Russia's not poor. Russia's the ninth largest economy in the world. They do have resources. And so people said there is no way they could feed Eastern Ukraine. Well, they feed Eastern Ukraine, right? They don't have trouble doing this. And oil prices continue to be high. And I think that it's not inconceivable that the Russians are going to have to put, billions of dollars towards the reconstruction of Syria, because if they don't, it's not victory, right? So it's not going to be a stable Assad government if there's no reconstruction. And so then fine, you did all of this military intervention, but you're not getting the outcome that you wanted, right? You're just sitting over a rubble pit with a very restless population, 70% of which is Sunni, right? It's not good for them. And so one possibility is that this just gives us a lot of leverage, right? And that one deal that could be struck is that we will provide reconstruction if Assad goes. You want reconstruction, the Syrian state will be maintained, it will be potentially still an Alawite government, right? Some sort of Alawite Christian Sunni, conglomeration. But that if you're going to want to get assistance from Europe or the United States, you're going to have to give up the Assads. And that might happen. It's certainly plausible. The alternative is Russia and Iran are going to have to do this themselves. We're currently sanctioning Iran, and their economy is extremely fragile. Iran is definitely not in a position to be providing this assistance. And so I feel like, we're winning. We're winning that peace. And so they are in a very difficult position.
I will resist the temptation to ask additional questions or raise additional. So I will open it up, and please introduce yourselves. Just tell your name and keep it short. Do we have a microphone or do we not need one? Okay, just speak up. I see that there was, did you want to ask the first question? He had his hand up, but I see you guys. Please. And you could rise.
No, it's fine.
No, but they
Definitely speak up.
Definitely
Yeah.
speak up, yes.
So you talked about Assad leaving the state of Syria, but we've seen the same cases with North Africa and Tunisia when the dictator left North Africa, and that did not really resolve in very good results in the beginning years. What do you expect to happen once Assad leaves? What conflicts do you expect to happen if the U.S. or Europe has the leverage and offers the bid?
So those are lots of ifs. I expect it's more like the Russians are going to be paying for reconstruction than that Assad is going to go. But Syria has a state, and it has, it is limited and requires external assistance, but it's not a personalistic regime in the way that, say, Libya was under Gaddafi, right? We're not talking about the same type of, like, you can substitute out the head of that state and put somebody else in, right? Which was kind of the idea of what was going to happen in this early, sort of 2010 phase, right? Was that you had a Syrian loyal but anti-Assad resistance. And it's not inconceivable that one of these military officers, you could have someone substitute for the Assads, but have the government maintain its integrity. It's a touchy issue whether you can get regime change or leadership change without the disintegration of the state. And I think when the regime is highly personalistic, you can't. But I'm not, I'm a Russia expert. I'm not necessarily a Syrianist, but my understanding is that it's enough of an impersonal regime that would be possible.
Yes.
I was just wondering, taking into account Russia's relationship with Iran, what role do you see Russia playing in the sort of Saudi Arabian, Iranian Cold War, and what will the different outcomes of that conflict lead to Russia, and do they really have something that they prefer in the end?
Sure, yeah. So Russia has already been doing what you're describing. They have been playing a role in this so-called cold conflict. They've been balancing, which is exactly what they do everywhere else. They've been able, this is part of the same pattern of maintaining good relations with both opposing sides. And we saw King Salman's visit to Moscow, which was pretty historic. It was just about a year ago this month, which in and of itself, from a symbolic value, just showed how Saudi Arabia perceived the importance of Russia in the region. There was cooperation in OPEC between Russia and Saudi Arabia over the summer on oil prices. And what's interesting here about Russia too is Russia sort of de facto solidifying its role within OPEC. And what the Saudi government has been doing is investing money in Russia with what I would say futile hope that Russia would turn away from Iran. And the Russian government was more than happy to take their money because they need the investments. But that hasn't changed their Iran policy. And when it comes to Iran, too, what's interesting is Russia and Iran are actually competitors on oil production, and yet, because of their anti-American interest, that tends to override their differences, and that's why they ultimately haven't divorced, I guess is one way to put it, despite their differences. So the way they're doing it is to play a balancing act and to look at each, to compartmentalize each relationship. And what's interesting is nobody's quite happy with Russia. The Iranians complain, they wish Russia would not be as close to Israel, for example. The Saudi government clearly doesn't want Russia to be as close to Iran. I think Putin has been proven uniquely talented at this balancing act, which may, again, there's always a possibility that it could go wrong. Up till now, it has worked. And I think that's the way he approaches it, is to balance. In a very realpolitik sort of way.
I think the changes taking place in Saudi Arabia have made it easier for Russia to have a relationship with them. I mean, when they were dealing with Wahhabi influence in Chechnya and in the North Caucasus and in Central Asia, this was seen as the primary threat, which is partly what led Russia to be very comfortable with radical Shiism, right? Because they didn't have any Shiites. But their Sunni populations were quite vulnerable to mobilization by the Saudis, but MBS, he's less inclined in that direction. He's sort of taking on some aspects of the clerical establishment, and so if this Khashoggi thing doesn't take him down, then they can behave more like a normal power. But there certainly was a kind of configuration of Russia and the Shiites, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and the U.S. on the other side. But that, those are fluid. This is very much a realpolitik kind of region, unless there's something that really gets in the way, like Saudi intervention in Russian domestic affairs.
Yeah, but now that Khashoggi was killed, Salman is surely his stake has risen with Putin. He's a fellow.
Yeah. Well, he's been he's been very quiet about all of this.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but,
He has.
yes, but personally, I'm sure that he has a great deal of sympathy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead and then Leah, yes,
Good
please.
evening. My name is Lee, fourth-year PhD candidate at American University School of International Service. My question is on Armenia. As you mentioned, traditionally in the past, Russia has been much more hostile toward democratic or orange revolutions in their neighboring areas. But this year in Armenia, Russia has been much more low-key in the way they regarded the Armenian democratic rallies. Is this a sign that Russia's attitude toward democratic revolution is changing, or is Armenia simply an outlier that makes it different from other cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, Russia's attitude is not changing towards democracy. I think that, first of all, the Armenian Revolution was more about internal corruption of the Armenian government. It was not ostensibly about joining NATO or the European Union or any of these Western structures. There's been some interesting reporting also that key members of the Armenian opposition were also in touch with Moscow, and Pashinyan actually made it quite, one of his very first comments was that they're not looking to move away from the Russian orbit, which I think was done for political reasons. Of course, now he stepped down, which is also interesting. I also suspect that the discussion about trying for Armenia internally to try to move away from Russia certainly exists within Armenia, but I think that Armenia has very little leverage over Russia, and this would, moving, they simply can't do it the way Ukraine had done it. I suspect the plan, if there was any, was to take much more careful steps. There was discussion of normalization with Turkey. I don't know if that's ever going to come to be. But basically, Armenia is limited, and the revolution was not ostensibly about overthrowing an authoritarian leader to replace. There were no EU flags flying, for example. The way the Ukrainians had it on the down.
Yeah, I don't think Russia has a problem with democracy. I think all the stuff about, Russia has this anti-democratic ideology that Putin reads Alexander Dugin, before going to bed at night, and, is heavily influenced by fascism. This stuff is all fantasy on the U.S. side. And then, for Armenia, yeah, they had a revolution, but they didn't want to, join NATO, right? Russia fears the United States, doesn't fear democracy. And as long as changes in political order don't lead to increased U.S. influence on their borders, they're pretty much fine with that.
All right. So how could the United States punish Turkey in a way that won't send Turkey into the Russian sphere of influence or just at large hamper U.S. strategic goals in the region? In addition, I'm curious, what degree of leverage does Turkey have over refugee policy, particularly with regards to Europe?
Great question. Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because you'll have a better answer. I'll give you time to think about it. So the Russian-Turkey connection I find baffling in so many ways. Because if you think about Turkey's position in the region, for example, right? Turkey has been on the Muslim Brotherhood side of things, supported the Morsi government, right? That they're part of their tension has been that they are more in line with this kind of revolutionary Islamism on the Sunni side, which, plus there's the Armenia connection, right? So Russia has a close relationship with Armenia. The Armenian-Turkish thing is, the Iranians and the Turks are in competition with one another. Turkey's a member of NATO. So there are so many ways in which Russian interests and Turkish ideology and interests do not align that I feel that Turkey's overtures to Russia are really thin and narrow. In other words, that's why I think that we could just put I don't think we're going to drive Turkey into Russian orbit by putting pressure on them. I think we're calling their bluff. If that makes sense.
And
they have a lot of leverage over refugee policy, but
Could you speak more on that? Or is
I'll-
that
Okay, so yeah, I mean, Turkey can turn on or off the tap on refugee policy here. We talk about Russia playing that role in Syria, but there's a really important country between Syria and Europe, and that's Turkey, and they've got a lot, Jordan has a lot too. There are a lot of refugees in the region, but Turkey has quite a bit. And so, yeah, Erdogan is very crafty in using his leverage. He's been using his leverage with, the killing of Khashoggi because he really has deep humanitarian concerns. No, of course not, right? This guy is, a terrible, terrible human being, right? And so, yes, they can play that card. Yes, they can suddenly release the hordes into Europe and tip the political regimes of Europe in a way that undermines all of the existing leaders, and they know it.
And so would that not give them leverage to push back against potential United States punishment?
We're somewhat far removed from that. And so it might be that we punish them and the Europeans don't. And we're diverging from Europe on sanctions in a whole bunch of ways. It's not clear that the Russian sanctions are going to last with this Italian government. So we're parting ways. The Obama administration worked incredibly hard to maintain that sort of joint stance. And I don't think this administration is working very hard to maintain that joint stance. And the circumstances are much more difficult. So I think we can punish, and the Europeans don't have to.
I guess, a couple of thoughts. One thing about Russia and Turkey, it is a very interesting relationship, as you say. Putin and Erdogan, on their personal relationship, has been very interesting, the way it's developed over the years. And prior to the downing of the Russian plane in Turkey, as you recall, by Turkey, in Syria, the two of them were very close. The two of them also, they both presided, they both took their country towards in the authoritarian direction. They both presided over improvements that lasted through the mid-2000s, and both of their countries then started this downward trajectory from these improvements. Where they differ, I think, is I actually think Turkey is falling into Russia's orbit, and I'm not sure if they're realizing it. I think between the two of them, Putin has more leverage over Turkey than Turkey has over Russia. Turkey certainly has leverage with refugees, I agree with you. Russia can turn on and off the tap of tourists into Turkey, and that's a huge source of revenue, and that happened. Turkey felt that in that period when, after the downing of the Russian plane. The Kurdish card is something that Russia plays all the time against Turkey, and it's a NATO. It's a NATO member, and I actually suspect that having Turkey in NATO is probably more beneficial because this way Turkey can continue sowing discord rather than being out of NATO.
Beneficial to
To Putin. So I suspect it's better for him that there is clearly an ally that's not acting like an ally, and one that, Turkey would have to vote itself out of NATO if it's a consensus-driven organization.
Turkey would have to what?
Vote itself out of NATO. So in other words, it's we can't kick Turkey out.
But we can relocate the bases.
Right, but we can. I agree, but we can relocate the bases. The only thing I would disagree with you on a little bit politically is I do think the Russian government very much cares about the issue of democracy. And this is why, if you observe the Putin protests in late 2011, 2012, this idea that the Russians can organize, that Ukrainian protests, Russian protests, the fear that people can't organize on their own, that somebody had to have instructed them to do this, is so pronounced in everything that the Russian officials and the Putin themselves have said. They say the same thing about the Arab Spring, that these people could not have done it on their own. This was a CIA operation. And with Ukraine in particular, I think it scared Putin because he thought if Ukraine could make itself a democracy, then Russia could do the same thing. I do think that the anti-democratic element is quite strong.
And so then, given that Putin has this either fear of democracy or at the very least fear of protests, the necessity of an outside force coming in and doing this, as opposed to that happening organically, why then is he less concerned about Armenia?
Right.
And why was he concerned about, say, like the Jasmine or the Crimson Revolution in Kyrgyzstan? I mean, that's way out there. It's for the same cause, anti corruption, I guess ostensibly pro democracy.
Right.
So, I guess my question is, why does he only care about some of these revolutions? At least using the Armenian example, I guess, is the outlier.
Yeah, well, it's also interesting, by the way, the Russian government's reaction to protests in Iran last year, which they didn't lead to a revolution necessarily, but they were pretty unprecedented. And Iran experts also talk about the possibility of more protests. Protests come in waves, and the story is certainly not over. I think, with Armenia, to go back to what I said, it was not ostensibly pro-Western the way the Ukrainian protests were. I do think that they were, it's quite possible they were taken by surprise also. The Kremlin is not, he's not 10 feet tall, he's not God. They do get surprised a lot. I also suspect that they were quite surprised by the Iranian protests. And because of their unique relationship with the Islamic Republic, I suspect if that government fall, I actually think the thought of that really scares them. Because they don't have connections here, they don't have relationships with all opposition parties, so they don't know what might come in its place. So if you look at what concerns them the most, it's about regime survival. So Putin, we know, has watched most obsessively the video of Gaddafi's murder. And Saddam Hussein's execution. He watched it over and over again because he felt that this was going to be his fate. And this is paranoid, but that's the mindset.
Fascinating. Do we have another question? I see you, Lee. Would you like to ask one?
So where do you think the current U.S. administration is going to go in this situation, given our current White House and such?
I think we're comfortable with the status quo. I don't think we're gonna provide assistance to Syria. So I think, in the region, we're not gonna change our relationship with Israel. We're gonna side with Israel in its regional struggles with Iran. And we might join in that struggle. And I think that Russia cannot join in that struggle. So I think this is where, I think that Russia was capable of projecting power when it was uncontested, right? So they can use civilian ships and turn them for military transport. But the U.S. is really the only power in the world that is capable of doing, that has the sea lift and the airlift, that is really capable of putting an expeditionary force into combat when nobody wants it there. And so, but we're not going to do that in this case. We might be doing it against Iran at some point. But Russia is certainly not going to stop us from doing that. But I think for the most part, we just have to accept Syria is not going to be a stable state. We're not getting to an end point of this. Russia's going to stay there. We're probably going to stay in some parts of Syria, particularly, like Al-Tanf, I guess. Yeah, right. This key node on the road between Tehran and the sea, And so that there are just some aspects here that we just are going to have to accept persistent ambiguity with not a great deal of expenditure or involvement on our part. And I think that's totally consistent with the Trump administration's thinking on this stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the question is, for me, with going back to our recently the shift in our policy with staying in Syria beyond defeating ISIS, I completely agree with you. We're the only ones that have the capability. And it's because Russia was not contested that they've been able to get away with so much. Absolutely with you. And I think they know that as well.
Yeah.
I think they're pretty aware of their limitations. What would be kind of both worrisome and interesting to observe is, will this policy of staying in Syria beyond defeating ISIS and pushing back against Iran, will it sustain? Because unfortunately our policy tends to shift, and certainly with this president, the question is, will that change again? But if there is a sustained effort, and I agree with you, we are going to side with Israel. This is an ally with whom we share values. This is a very deep friendship, and Putin also knows that he cannot replace the United States in his relationship with Israel. I actually think for him the relationship with Israel is more of an asset that he uses against the West. And so, the question is, will our policy sustain? How far are we going to push back against Iran? Are we going to be consistent, or are we again going to sort of flip-flop? And to me, the major issue is that we flip-flopped so much. We talked about Assad having to go, but we didn't do anything about it. We just sort of expected that it would happen, and it didn't. So are we going to be consistent?
Well, we will have Lee as our last question.
I guess my question is, the big elephant in the room that most of you already mentioned, which is President Donald Trump. My question is, so-called bromance between Trump and Putin, does it really exist? And even if it does exist, have you actually seen signs that this personal relationship between the two leaders bringing actual changes to the relationship between the two countries? Or leaders' friendship is its own thing, countries' clash of interests is another thing altogether?
The elephant in the room, sure. I think, look, Trump's rhetoric on Russia certainly has been worrisome. The Helsinki summit, the public summit that we saw, also painful, yes. Yeah. I'm struggling to find great words. There are a lot of questions to be asked. That said, I think here's what's interesting. Despite the Russian government's ostensive applause in the Duma when Trump won, I think they were surprised. I don't think they expected him to win. Clearly, he was their preferred candidate from the rhetoric that they put out. But they've also spun a message which is also a very typical one for Russia, that is that there's no democracy in America and that the election is rigged. You saw that through the RT, Russia Today tweets. What happened actually undermined that message, so clearly something was not right there. And what I also thought was sort of interesting as I was watching this is the Russian people actually saw an election where a result is not predetermined. The message was that this is all predetermined, but it wasn't. I also suspect Trump was surprised that he won. Also, despite all of these very painful, very worrisome issues that surround the Trump and Putin, the Trump administration, as opposed to the Trump the person, has come out with more sanctions against Russia, not less. Trump has not given Crimea to Putin. These questions, they remain, and it would be good to have more clarity on them. I do think the idea of collusion is a little bit overblown. That's my view.
Did you want to add to that?
I would just add that we're a difficult partner for anybody. And the Russians may not think we're a democracy, but they're now acutely aware of the separation of powers and that Congress can act on its own as a legislative body, regardless almost of what the president wishes. And I do think that there is a lot of tacit cooperation on Syria, or coordination. Congress has forbidden it, which is why we have to call it a deconfliction center rather than coordination. There's been quite a bit of coordination. And I think that message goes down the pipe. And I think part of our national security strategy is, let's coordinate with the Russians so that we get better outcomes in Syria, and that they're investing heavily in Syria so we don't have to deal with them somewhere else.
Well, That's actually a rather positive way of thinking, considering.
Mr. Sunshine, in my opinion.
All right, that's great. We have the floor is yours, sir.
All right, well, I won't take up too much more time here, but I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out to the Alexander Hamilton Society's event on Russian involvement in the Middle East, and especially to our speakers, Ms. Borshchevskaya, apologies, Professor Professor Darden, and of course, Dr. Pilon for being here tonight and leading this discussion. I would just like to remind you, to all the new faces in the room, that you can like us on Facebook. That's where we post the majority of our content. All of our event pages are posted right there. So if you're interested, please give that a like to stay updated with what we're doing. And to follow us on Twitter, that's AHS@AU, AHS_@AT_AU. And feel free to, of course, grab some pizza on the way out. Looks like there's some more cheese and pepperoni. But other than that, I hope you all have a great evening. Thank you for coming.
That was good.